Nebraska tableland in early spring. The grass runs flat to the horizon in one direction, bent by a wind that never stops, the color of old rope. Frost still lines the inside of the cabin window. The air tastes of iron and distance, and the only sound is the low moan of moving air finding every crack in every wall it passes. A woman stands at the north side of a cabin with her palm pressed flat against the logs. Behind her, a child coughs from a bed too large for her. Against the east wall, a cord and a half of cottonwood sits where 6 cords should be. The death notice had come by way of a neighbor's boy on a borrowed horse, 3 days after the wagon rolled. Thomas Lorimer had been hauling fence posts from the cedar breaks along the middle loop when the rear axle snapped on a late-thaw rut. The team bolted. The load shifted. He was pinned under 800 pounds of green timber for the better part of an hour before anyone found him, and by then the damage to his chest was the kind no doctor within 40 miles could have mended. Mara Lorimer buried her husband on a Tuesday in March of 1884, in ground still frozen 3 inches down. She had to borrow a pick from the Bessett claim to break the crust. Willa, 5 years old and still coughing from a winter sickness that had never fully left her lungs, stood beside the hole in a coat 2 sizes too large and asked if the dirt would keep him warm. Mara said yes. She did not know what else to say. 3 men came to the burial. One was the circuit preacher, who read from a book he carried in his saddlebag and left before the dirt was tamped flat. One was Halvor Steen, who farmed the quarter section north of the Bassetts and said nothing because he could not speak English well enough for funerals. The third was a hired hand from Door's outfit, who stood at a distance and watched, as if counting what the grave would free up. By the time the last shovel of soil was pressed down, Mara owned the following: 160 acres of Custer County tableland under homestead proof, a cabin with 3 finished walls and a north face still lacking chinking between half the logs, 2 milk cows whose ribs showed through their winter coats, 1 lame mare with a hock swollen to the size of a turnip, a breaking plow Thomas had not yet paid off, a cook stove with a cracked firebox plate that leaked smoke into the room when the wind blew wrong, a daughter who weighed less than the water bucket, and $41 in a coffee tin hidden behind the flour sack. She also owned a debt. Rafe Dorr, cattle buyer out of Broken Bow, held a note against the Lorimer claim for $63, the cost of wire, a breeding heifer that had died in January, and store credit Thomas had drawn against the spring calf crop that would never arrive. The note came due before first snow. Dorr had sent no condolences. He had sent a reminder, folded once and sealed with candle wax, delivered by the same hired hand who had watched the burial from a distance. Mara stood in the doorway of her cabin 2 days after the funeral and looked north. The land ran flat for 1.5 miles before it broke into the shallow draws that fed the Loup drainage. There was nothing between her cabin and the horizon but grass the color of old rope, a single cottonwood that leaned east from a lifetime of wind, and the posts of an unfinished fence line Thomas had started in October and would never complete. The wind came from that direction in winter. It came hard, it came steady, and it came with nothing to slow it down. She had 1.5 cords of cottonwood split and stacked against the east wall. Cottonwood burns fast and hot for an hour, then collapses to ash that holds no heat through the night. A hard winter in Custer County demanded 6 cords minimum of decent hardwood, 8 if January turned mean. The arithmetic was not complicated. It was fatal. An Emery Vale arrived on a Thursday morning, riding a gray gelding with a county brand on its hip. He was 61 years old, whittled down by decades of wind and poor coffee to a frame that seemed to be made entirely of leather, bone, and disapproval. He held the title of County Stock Inspector, which meant he rode a circuit checking brands, counting losses, and telling people things they did not want to hear. He had known Thomas. He had liked Thomas well enough to say so at the funeral, which was more than most men got from Emery Vale. Now he had come to see what Thomas had left behind. Mara met him in the yard with Willa on her hip. Emery touched his hat brim and dismounted without being asked. He did not offer pleasantries. He walked the property. He walked slow. He started at the north wall and ran his hand along the gaps between logs where the chinking should have been. His fingers disappeared into 3 of them, up to the second knuckle. He pulled out a fistful of dry grass that the wind had packed into the cracks and let it scatter. He looked at the roof and traced the gap on the northwest corner where the sod had slumped away from the ridgepole, leaving a hole wide enough to push a fist through. He crouched and looked at the sill logs and found rot where snowmelt had sat against unseasoned wood all winter. He counted the woodpile without touching it. His lips moved. He did not bother to hide his expression. He checked the well by dropping a stone and listening. Shallow, silty, prone to freezing, the kind of well that worked 8 months a year and failed during the 2 months when water mattered most. He walked to the cow pen, which was 3 strands of wire stapled to cottonwood posts, and tested the tension with his hand. The wire sang a loose, flat note. He looked at the cows and saw hip bones standing up like tent ridges under their hides. Then he came back to where Mara stood and took off his hat, which was the only gentleness he had, and it meant the news was going to be bad. "You have half a north wall," Emery said. "The chinking is either gone or it was never there, and the gaps run wide enough that you might as well leave the door open. You have maybe a cord and a half of cottonwood, which burns like paper and holds heat like a sieve. You need 6 cords of elm, or ash, or hackberry minimum, 8 if January turns hard. You have a roof gap that will drift full before Christmas, and a stovepipe collar that is warped enough to whistle when the wind hits 20 miles an hour." He paused and looked at the open ground to the north. "You have no windbreak," he said. "No grove, no board fence, no sod wall taller than your knee. Board lumber comes by rail to Broken Bow and by wagon from there 22 miles over Bad Road. It costs $4 a 100 board feet, and you need 1,000 feet minimum to build a windbreak worth having. That is $40 without counting freight and nails. I know what is in your coffee tin, Mrs. Lorimer, because Thomas told me last fall when he was trying to borrow against the spring calves." He looked at the cow pen. "Those calves are not coming." "I know what I have, Mr. Vale." "Then you know what you do not have." He settled his hat back on his head. "A woman alone can maybe keep a stove fed. She cannot keep the wind from eating the house. Your north wall will lose heat faster than you can make it. That gap in the roof will fill with snow and melt into your bedding. The stovepipe seams will leak so much draft that half your heat goes up and out before it warms the room. I am not asking for your inventory." "No, you are not asking for anything, which is part of the problem." He tucked his thumbs into his belt. "I'm telling you what I would tell Thomas if he were standing here instead of buried in that ground. This claim, in this condition, will not winter a woman and a child. Not safely, not probably." Mara shifted Willa higher on her hip. The child's fingers gripped a fistful of her mother's collar and held tight. "Then what should I do?" "Sell to door before the note comes due. Take whatever he offers and count it a mercy. Go east to your people." "I have no people east." "Family of some kind." "Everyone has family." "My father died in 81, my mother the year after. I have a sister in Pennsylvania who married a man with opinions about dependence." Emery looked at her for a long time. The wind moved the grass behind him in a single direction, like water pouring over a ledge, steady and indifferent. "Then you have a problem," he said. He mounted and rode south without looking back. Mara stood in the yard holding Willa and watched him disappear into the grass. The wind pushed against her skirt, and found the gaps in the cabin's north wall and moved through the house behind her with a low sound, like someone drawing breath through clenched teeth. She could not leave. If she abandoned the claim, Dorr took the livestock against the note. The $41 would vanish into the balance. She would arrive in Broken Bow with a sick child, no money, no trade, and no one waiting for her. The nearest town with any charity work was Grand Island, 100 miles east, and getting there required a horse that could walk without limping, which hers could not. Thomas had been her geography, her map, her reason for being in Custer County at all. Without him, she had no direction except the 160 acres under her feet, and if she left those, she left everything: the proof years, the improvements, the cabin he had died trying to finish. She put Willa down. The child tottered to the stoop and sat with her legs hanging over the edge, coughing once into her fist. Mara walked to the north wall. She pressed her palm flat against the logs and felt the wind pushing through the cracks. It was March. The air was cold, but not killing. By January, it would be both. The enemy was not just temperature. The enemy was the moving air itself, the way it found every seam, every gap, every imperfect joint, and pulled heat from the cabin like a man pulling thread from a hem. She could burn 6 cords and still lose the battle if the wind stole the warmth before her body could hold it. The cabin was not shelter. It was a sieve with a fire in it. She did not yet know what to do about the wind, but she understood for the first time, and with a clarity that felt like stepping off a ledge, that the wind was the thing to fight. The insight came in April, on a day when the spring gale blew hard enough to rattle the stovepipe and scatter a fine grit of sand across the cabin floor. Mara had hung a wet quilt over the doorway to block the dust from reaching Willa's bed. The quilt caught the full force of the blow, snapped taut as a sail, and tore 2 of its hanging nails from the frame. It slapped against the floor and lay there, defeated. Beside the stoop, a willow basket she used for carrying cow chips sat wedged between 2 flat stones. Tumbleweed had tangled in its ribs during the night. 3 brown knots caught in the weave. The basket had not moved. The weeds had caught and held. The wind had passed through the gaps in the willow and continued on, weaker, leaving the debris behind. Mara crouched beside it and looked at the basket and the quilt and thought about the difference. She thought of her father. Amos Selkirk had been a barrel maker in Bureau County, Illinois. Not a frontiersman, not a farmer, a man who understood the behavior of wood under pressure, the geometry of staves, the way force distributes itself across a curved surface. When Mara was 9 years old, he had shown her something in his workshop on a windy October day. He stood a solid pine board upright in the open doorway. The wind caught it flat and knocked it over in 2 seconds. Then he replaced it with a slatted drying rack, gaps between every other board, each gap as wide as the board beside it. The rack stood. The wind pressed through the gaps, diminished, and scattered itself across the floor of the shop in smaller gusts that could not topple anything. A solid face takes the whole blow, her father had said, holding the rack steady with one hand. A broken face makes the blow spend itself. She had filed the lesson the way children file things. Interesting, unimportant, stored somewhere behind arithmetic and the taste of her mother's bread. Now, kneeling in Nebraska mud 20 years later with dust in her teeth and a torn quilt at her feet, the lesson became something else entirely. She did not need a solid wall between the wind and the cabin. A solid wall, even if she could afford board lumber to build one, would throw the gale up and over its top edge, and the wind would curl back down on the far side, with nearly as much force, or channel around the ends with greater speed. She had seen this happen. Sod banks along barn walls caught the snow, but the wind screamed over the top and scoured the yard behind them clean. What she needed was something porous, something that broke the wind into smaller pieces and made each piece spend its energy pushing through the barrier, something that stood in the wind's path and did not try to stop it completely, but said, "You may pass, but you will arrive weaker," and it had to be alive. Boards cost money she did not have. Sod crumbled after 2 seasons. Wire held cattle, not wind, but a living hedge, a thing that grew its own repairs, closed its own gaps season by season, and thickened with every year of trimming. That was something she could plant with labor and time instead of dollars. She stood up and walked 50 paces from the cabin in the direction the north wind came from. She turned and looked back at the house. From that distance, the cabin looked small, exposed, naked, a box sitting on the open prairie with nothing around it but grass and sky and a cottonwood tree that had already surrendered its posture to the gale. If she put a barrier here 50 feet out, the wind would hit it first. It would fight through the barrier, losing speed, losing force, and arrive at the cabin walls as something smaller, something the chinking and sod banking could handle. But what kind of barrier? She needed something thorny enough that cattle would not push through it, dense enough that the wind could not pass unimpeded, tall enough to matter, and hardy enough to survive on the high plains without irrigation or constant care. At Sutter's store the following week, she found the answer leaning against the back wall behind 3 sacks of millet, 3 bundles of Osage Orange seedlings tied with twine and wrapped in burlap that had gone stiff with neglect. Their roots were brown at the tips and dry from weeks without water. Their bark was pale green where it was alive and gray where it was not. Their thorns, each one as long as Mara's thumbnail and hard as bone, were sharp enough to draw blood through a wool glove. Sutter had ordered them for a farmer east of the Platte who had never come to collect. They sat in the dim back of the store like orphans. "Thorny trash," Sutter said when Mara asked. "That man paid freight and never showed. I will give you the lot for what the shipping cost me. $3.40. Mara counted out the coins. $37.60 left in the coffee tin. Every dollar she spent on seedlings was a dollar she could not spend on nails, flour, or medicine for Willa's cough. She carried the bundles home in the back of the cart behind the limping mare. The seedlings rattled against each other like dry bones. She laid them in the shade of the east wall with their roots in wet burlap and counted them one by one, separating the living from the dead by the color of the inner bark. A scratch of green meant life. Gray meant kindling. 263 seedlings, roughly 180 showed green. She needed 750 to close the ring. The design took shape through labor, not theory. She marked a rough circle 50 feet from the cabin walls using a length of rope tied to a stake. 375 feet of circumference, give or take. She planned 3 staggered rows, each 18 inches apart within the row, with the middle row offset so that a straight line of wind would never see a straight gap through all 3. The principle was her father's. Not a wall, but a screen. Not a dam, but a drag. She did not call it engineering. She stood at the north mark with a shovel in her blistered hands and said to no one, "If the wind has teeth, I will give it thorns to chew." Cora Bessett arrived the next morning with a jar of milk and a face arranged for argument. Cora was 31, the wife of a dryland farmer named Orrin Bessett, who spent more time complaining about grasshoppers than fighting them, the mother of 2 boys who could turn any object into a weapon or a mess, and the closest thing to a friend Mara had within walking distance. She was practical the way a splitting maul is practical. She struck once, and whatever was in front of her either opened up or shattered. She looked at the seedlings laid out in their rows along the shade. She looked at the circle scored in the dirt. She looked at Mara's cracked and bleeding hands and at the coffee tin, which was noticeably lighter. "You spent money on sticks," Cora said. Seedlings. Sticks with thorns. Switches that a rabbit could step over. Cora picked one up. A thorn caught the pad of her thumb, and she dropped it, pressing the wound against her apron. You want to tell me what these are going to do for you in January? When the wind comes through that north wall at 30 miles an hour and the snow is piling against the door, are these switches going to burn? Are they going to keep Willa warm? They are not for burning. Then what, Mara? Mara explained. The porous barrier, the wind spending its energy pushing through the thorns. The circle set far enough from the cabin that the gale would be broken and slowed before it reached the walls. The principle her father had taught her about a slatted face versus a solid one. Cora listened with the expression of a woman being told that singing would make the butter come faster. Your father made barrels, Cora said. He did not live through a Nebraska winter. He understood force. Force. Cora looked at the 1.5 cords of cottonwood against the east wall. Here is force. You need 6 cords. You have that. Every hour you spend kneeling in the dirt nursing weeds is an hour you are not cutting and splitting and stacking. Every hour you waste is an hour closer to a night when the stove goes cold and your daughter is still coughing. I know. Then why? Because 6 cords will not save me if the wind steals every degree before it reaches the bed. Mara's voice was steady, but her hands were shaking, and she pressed them against her thighs to make them stop. I can feed the stove until I drop, Cora. If the wind takes the heat faster than I make it, I'm just burning time. Cora set the milk jar on the stoop. The glass clinked against the wood. She stood there a moment, looking at the circle in the dirt, and her face shifted from argument to something that might have been pity, or might have been the expression a person wears when they see someone walking toward a cliff and cannot decide whether to shout or look away. I have watched women die on this prairie, Cora said quietly. Not from lack of ideas, from lack of firewood. She walked back across the flat toward her own claim. She did not look back. Mara stood in the silence that followed and felt the doubt settle into her chest like cold water. Cora was not wrong. Every hour planting was an hour not cutting. If the hedge failed, if the seedlings died, if the growth was too slow, if the principle was sound in a barrel shop and useless on an open plain, she would have traded irreplaceable labor for nothing, and the winter would collect the debt without mercy. She picked up the first seedling and walked to the north mark. The risk calculation was brutal and simple. She would still cut wood. She would still bank sod. She would still patch the roof and chink the walls, and do everything a solitary woman on a homestead was supposed to do. But every spare hour, the early mornings before Willa woke, the long violet evenings after supper, the Sundays that other women spent resting or visiting, those hours belonged to the hedge. If she was right, the thorns would break the wind and the cabin would hold. If she was wrong, the thorns would have stolen the time that might have kept her daughter alive. By the middle of May, the first row was visible from the road, a thin, ragged crescent of green shoots and brown sticks curving away from the cabin's north side, each plant no taller than a man's forearm. Mara had set 112 seedlings in the ground. She watered them twice a day from the well, 2 buckets at a time, balanced on a neck yoke that left bruises across her shoulders. 47 had taken root and were pushing new growth. The rest sat in the soil like headstones, gray and still, waiting for her to admit they were finished. It was enough to become a joke. The cowboys who rode for Rafe Dorr's outfit passed the Lorimer claim twice a week, moving cattle between spring grass. They could see the curve of tiny plants from the road. They could see the woman kneeling with a bucket and a rag, pressing mud around roots that might already be dead. One of them started calling it the widow's crown. The name traveled. At Sutter's store, a rancher's wife said Mara was fencing the view and leaving the cattle country open. The storekeeper repeated it to Cora, who repeated it to Mara without softening, because Cora did not believe in softening. They think you have gone peculiar, Cora said, standing in Mara's doorway with her arms folded. A woman planting thorns in a circle when she ought to be cutting wood. Mara was on her knees in the dirt, pressing wet clay around a seedling that had tilted in the night wind. She said nothing. She was counting roots. Then Rafe Dorr came. He rode up on a bay horse with a saddle that cost more than Mara's cabin and everything in it. He stopped at the edge of the outer row and sat there, looking. He was 42, clean-shaved except for a mustache he kept trimmed short, and he had the kind of patience that came not from virtue, but from knowing that time was on his side. He held Thomas's debt note. He held credit relationships with every merchant between the Lou and the Platte. He held the ear of the county assessor, and he held a specific, patient interest in the Lorimer claim because the shallow draw on Mara's south quarter held the best winter grass within 12 miles of his operation. He did not need the claim, he wanted it, and wanting for a man like Dorr was the same as expecting. He watched Mara press mud around a seedling with her raw fingers. His shadow fell across her hands. Mrs. Lorimer. Mr. Dorr. I heard about Thomas. I'm sorry for your trouble. Mara did not look up. Thank you. I came to make you a fair offer. He settled in the saddle, leather creaking. I will buy the claim for the debt plus $10. That is $73 clear. You take the mare, the household goods, whatever you can carry. No note, no balance, no obligation. You go wherever you need to go and you go clean. No, you have not thought about it. I do not need to think about it. The claim is worth $600 on proof. You are offering $73. I am offering you no debt and a way out. I am not looking for a way out. Dorr shifted his gaze from Mara to the seedlings. He studied the line of tiny shoots, the gaps where dead sticks still stood, the stakes and twine, the muddy circle scored into the prairie. He looked at it the way a man looks at a map that shows a road ending at a river with no bridge. What are these? He asked. Osage Orange. A hedge? Yes. What is a hedge going to do for you, Mrs. Lorimer? Break the wind. Dorr smiled. It was small, controlled, and precise. The smile of a man who has just received confirmation of something he already believed. He looked at the cabin with its patched north wall and its slumped roof corner and its meager woodpile and its lame mare standing hip-shot in the pen. A weed fence won't warm a stove, he said. He turned the bay horse and rode south toward his own range. The dust from his horse's hooves settled over the seedlings like a judgment delivered and recorded. Mara wrapped her bleeding thumb in a strip torn from a worn-out petticoat. She stood, brushed the dirt from her knees, and walked to Sutter's store. She bought twine instead of coffee, because the seedlings needed tying to stakes and her hands alone could not hold them straight against the wind. The twine cost 20 cents. She had $37.40 left. That night, she lay awake listening to Willa cough, short, dry sounds in the dark, like a small animal trying to clear something from its throat. She thought about what Dorr had said. He was not wrong about the stove. A hedge would not make fire. It would not replace the 4.5 cords she still needed. It would not pay the $63 debt, or chink the roof, or mend the mare's hock, or put weight on her daughter's bones. But Dorr had smiled, and the smile told her everything. He was counting on her failure. He had calculated the odds. A woman alone, a child sick, a claim unfinished, a winter coming, and he had found them favorable. Her failure was not a risk he feared. It was an outcome he was waiting for. She closed her eyes and counted the living seedlings in her mind. 47 in the North Arc, pushing new leaves. She needed 703 more to close the ring. She had the rest of spring, all of summer, and part of the autumn before the first hard freeze. She fell asleep counting. The trampled seedlings appeared on a Friday morning in late May. Mara found them in the northwest section of the outer row. 3 plants snapped off at the base, their roots torn from the softened soil, the ground around them churned by hoof prints. Not cow prints, horse, a shod horse, the crescent marks sharp and deliberate in the damp earth. The tracks crossed the row at an angle, as though the rider had turned his mount directly into the line of green and walked through without slowing. She crouched over the damage with her hands on her knees and felt something settle behind her ribs that was colder than fear. The hoof prints led south, toward Door's Range. She could not prove a thing. The open prairie carried riders in every direction, and anyone could claim they had passed through without seeing a row of seedlings no taller than boot tops. But the tracks did not follow the road. They crossed the row at its weakest point, where the plants were smallest and the gaps widest, and the damage was too precise to be accidental. 3 plants, 3 breaks, 3 messages. Someone had tested the hedge before the weather ever would. Mara replanted the 3 gaps with seedlings from her reserve stock, the weakest ones, the brown-tipped doubtful ones she had been saving against winter kill losses. 3 replacements for a deliberate act. She tamped the soil with hands that shook, and the shaking was not from cold. She had to protect the hedge from people before it could protect her from winter. The scale of the work ahead pressed down on her like a hand on the back of her neck. The first row needed staking against wind and livestock. The second row existed as marks in the dirt and nothing more. The third row was a prayer. Summer lay ahead with its demand for labor on every front. Wood to cut, sod to bank, a roof to patch, a child to feed, 2 cows to milk, a kitchen garden to plant if they were going to eat anything besides corn mush and milk through the winter, and 703 more holes to dig in a circle that most of Custer County considered a monument to grief and madness. Mara went to the creek and found a sandstone ledge with a flat face. She sharpened the shovel on it until the edge threw light. She walked to the next mark on the North Arc, drove the blade into the ground, and turned the earth. 1 hole, then another, then another. The first row had 47 living plants. She needed 703 more. Summer had 90 days of growing weather left. Winter did not negotiate. If you have ever been told that what you were building was foolish by someone who could not see what you were fighting, we want to hear about it in the comments. Because Mara Lorimer was not planning a fence. She was building an argument with the wind, and the wind was not going to wait for her to finish. She planted until her shoulder seized and the light turned copper, and the shadow of the cottonwood stretched across the yard like a fallen post. Then she washed her hands in the bucket, carried Willa to bed, fed the stove its small ration of cottonwood, and sat in the open doorway watching the last color drain from the sky. The north wind pressed against the cabin. It found the gaps she had chinked and the gaps she had missed. It moved through the room behind her, bending the stove flame, lifting the edge of the flour sack, touching Willa's hair where it lay across the pillow. Somewhere out on the flat, a coyote called. The sound carried for miles because there was nothing to stop it. Nothing to stop anything on this prairie. Not yet. Summer arrived with heat and wind and the particular cruelty of prairie weather, which is that it reminds you of winter even when the sweat is running down your back. June brought thunderstorms that hammered the seedlings flat. July brought grasshoppers that stripped leaves from the east arc in a single afternoon, leaving the stems naked and trembling like plucked quills. August brought a drought that cracked the soil and turned the well water to brown silt that Mara had to strain through muslin before she could pour it on roots. She worked in a rhythm that left no room for rest. Morning, milk the cows, feed Willa, water the first row from west to east. Mid-morning, dig holes for the second row, setting each seedling 18 inches from the last, packing the roots in clay mixed with creek sand. Afternoon, cut cottonwood from the draw south of the claim, drag it back with the lame mare, split it against a stump with an axe that Thomas had never properly hafted. Evening, water the first row again from east to west, check for dead plants, mark the gaps. Her hands changed. The blisters came first, then broke, then came again in different places. By the end of June, the skin across her palms had thickened into callus that cracked along the grain like old leather. She wrapped her fingers in strips of flour sack to keep the blood off the seedlings. Willa watched her mother's hands with the seriousness of a child who understands that damage is being done, but not why. The second row went in through July and August. Mara planted from seed where she could, Osage Orange fruit split open and pressed into furrows, the pale seeds tucked into the earth like teeth pushed into clay. The seeds were slow. Some would not sprout until the following spring. She filled the gaps between seeds with transplanted root suckers dug from beneath the strongest first-row plants, each one a fist-sized knot of root and pale shoot that she carried to its new position in a tin cup of water. By September of 1884, the North Arc had 109 living plants in the first row and 62 in the second. The East and West Arcs were thinner, 40 plants each, unevenly spaced, some already brown. The South Arc barely existed. The circle was more suggestion than structure, a dotted line drawn in green and brown around a cabin that still looked naked from any distance. She had cut 3 cords of cottonwood. She needed 6. The first winter was coming, and the hedge was not going to save her from it. She knew that. The hedge was a 3-year bet, and she was still in year 1. That first winter nearly killed them anyway. January of 1885 brought 2 weeks of cold that froze the well solid and turned the cabin into a box of pain. Mara burned through her woodpile by February and spent the last 6 weeks of winter burning twisted grass, cow chips, and the broken posts from Thomas's unfinished fence. She and Willa slept in the same bed under every blanket and quilt they owned, and on the worst nights Mara brought the smaller cow inside and let the animal's body heat supplement the dying stove. The wind came through every gap she had missed. The sod roof leaked snowmelt onto the floor. Willa's cough deepened into something that rattled when she breathed. They survived. Barely. The word felt generous. Spring of 1885. Mara walked the hedge rows and counted the dead. Winterkill had taken a third of the first row and half the second. 61 plants gone, frozen out, or snapped by ice load, or simply overwhelmed by cold that no first-year seedling was built to endure. She replanted every gap. She traded sowing for seedlings. 6 shirts hemmed for Cora's boys earned her 40 Osage Orange starts from a nursery wagon passing through on its way to the Platte settlements. And then Leander Voss arrived. He came in a wagon pulled by 2 draft horses with feathered hooves and patient eyes. The wagon was loaded with wind-damaged nursery stock, apple whips, plum rootstock, cottonwood saplings, and bundles of hedge plants that had been knocked loose in a spring hailstorm near Grand Island. Leander was 56, Swiss-born, with a face the color of walnut heartwood and hands that were so scarred from years of grafting work that the lines of his palms had disappeared under a crosshatch of white tissue. He had worked in Illinois fruit orchards for 15 years before moving west, and he had learned hedge laying from German settlers in Bureau County who had carried the technique from the old country like a recipe. He stopped his wagon on the road beside the Lorimer claim because something had caught his eye. Mara was kneeling in the north arc, tying a second-year seedling to a stake with strips of cotton. She did not notice the wagon until the horses blew and stamped, and when she looked up, she saw a man with a leather apron climbing down from the seat and walking toward her rows with the slow, deliberate gait of someone examining work they understand. Leander did not introduce himself. He walked the first row from west to east, stopping at each plant, bending to look at the spacing, the soil line, the direction of the new growth. He crouched at the offset between the first and second rows and looked through the gap and nodded once. He found the southeast opening where Mara had left a working gate and stood in it, facing the wind, and held his hand out flat to feel the air moving through the rows on either side. Then he walked back to Mara and said, in an accent that turned his W's into V's and his TH's into hard T's, "You did not plant this randomly. No. Your rows are staggered. The middle row is offset. No straight line of wind can pass through all three without meeting stems. That is the idea." Whose idea? Mine. Leander looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were pale blue, almost gray, set deep in a face that had been narrowed by years of squinting into sun and wind. He did not look surprised. He looked the way a man looks when he finds a well-made joint in a piece of rough furniture, not amazed, but satisfied. "You have gaps," he said. "Your winter kill was bad, and your second row is too thin on the east side, but the principle is correct." He paused. "Who taught you about porous barriers?" "My father. He made barrels." Leander Voss smiled for the first time. It changed his whole face. "A cooper," he said. "A cooper's daughter planting hedge on the Nebraska plain. That is the best thing I have heard this month." He sold her 40 seedlings at cost and threw in 20 more that he said were too damaged to sell, but might live if she treated them right. Then he showed her how. The first lesson came that afternoon. Leander dug a shallow trench beside the cabin wall, filled it with damp sand from the creek, and heeled the damaged seedlings into it. Roots buried, stems angled, the whole bundle tucked into the moist sand like a patient put to bed. "Never plant a dry root," he said. "A dry root is already dead. It just does not know yet. You let them drink for 3 days in wet sand. Then you plant." Mara watched his hands. They moved with the economy of a man who had done this 10,000 times. The second lesson came the following morning. Leander walked the first row and stopped at a seedling that had grown 2 feet tall, with a single straight leader reaching for the sky. He pulled a pruning knife from his belt, a short, curved blade worn thin from decades of sharpening, and cut the leader off 6 inches above the ground. Mara made a sound. "No," Leander said. "Listen, this plant wants to be a tree. You do not want a tree. You want a wall. If you let it grow tall, it will be thin at the bottom and the wind will pass under it like water under a door. You cut the leader low. You force it to push side branches. Each side branch becomes a stem. Each stem pushes its own branches. In 2 years, this plant will be wider than your shoulders, and so thick a dog could not push through it." He handed her the knife. "Cut every leader that stands taller than your knee. Do it now, before the summer growth hardens." Mara spent the next 3 days cutting. Every cut felt like a wound. She was shortening plants she had spent a year keeping alive. But by the end of the week, she could see the logic. The trimmed plants were already pushing buds from their lower nodes, each bud the beginning of a branch that would fill the gaps between stems. Leander stayed a week that first visit. He slept in his wagon and ate meals at Mara's table and told Willa stories about Swiss mountain goats that could walk on walls. He checked every plant in the circle and marked the ones that were too far gone to save, with a twist of red yarn. There were 31. He helped Mara pull them and replace them with his damaged stock. Before he left, he told her one more thing. In the 3rd year, he said, when the stems are thick enough to resist, I will show you how to plash. You will bend the young wood, half cut the stubborn branches, and weave them into the uprights beside them. You will close every gap with living wood. The hedge will become a single thing, not a row of plants, but a wall of thorns that grows tighter every year. Will you come back? If I am alive and the roads are open. He clicked his tongue at the horses, and the wagon rolled east, leaving tracks in the dust that filled in before noon. Emery Vale came back in October of 1885. He rode the same gray gelding. He dismounted with the same economy of movement. He walked the hedgerows the way he had walked the cabin a year and a half earlier, slowly, thoroughly, with the expression of a man looking for what was wrong. The hedge had grown. The first row plants averaged 3 feet. The second row was filling in. The trimmed seedlings had pushed side growth that was beginning to tangle with neighboring stems. It was still thin. It was still more gap than barrier, but it was alive, and it was bigger than anyone except Mara had expected. Emery stood in the north arc and looked through the rows toward the cabin. He could see the door, the stovepipe, the patched roof. The wind pressed against his back and moved through the seedlings with a sound like cards being shuffled. It is taller, he said. Yes. It may stop a calf by next year. It will not stop the wind. You said that last time. I was right last time. Your first winter proved it. You nearly froze. Mara's jaw tightened. I did not freeze. Your daughter coughed for 3 months. Your well froze. You burned fence posts. Emery turned and looked at her. I'm not trying to hurt you, Mrs. Lorimer. I'm telling you what I see. This hedge may someday hold cattle. That would be useful. But a stock fence and a windbreak are different things. If this grows tall and dense, it will catch snow. It will build drifts against itself, and those drifts will bury it, and the wind will come over the top the same as it comes over a sod wall. Not if the porosity is right. The what? The gaps. If the hedge is not solid, if the wind can push through it, but slowly, the snow drops on the windward side and the air arrives behind it without the force to build drifts against the cabin. Emery looked at her as though she had spoken in a language he did not recognize. Where did you learn that word? From a nurseryman. A nurseryman. Emery put his hat on. I have lived on this prairie for 31 years. I have never heard a nurseryman's opinion save a life. He rode away, but he did not offer to buy her out, and he did not mention Dor. Leander returned in the spring of 1886, and again in the spring of 1887, each time staying longer, each time teaching more. In 1886, he taught Mara to read Winter Wind by the snowtails behind fence posts and the lean of dried grass, the direction of the prevailing gale written on every surface if you knew how to look. He did not give lectures. He made her kneel in a field after a March blow and feel the hardened drift crust with her bare hand and tell him which direction the wind had come from based on the angle and texture of the frozen surface. This is not a classroom, he said when she got it wrong the first time. This is the examination. The prairie gives the lesson every day. You have to be paying attention. In the spring of 1887, Leander taught her to plash. The stems were ready. 3 years of growth and trimming had produced wood thick enough to bend without snapping, some of it as wide as Mara's wrist, with bark that had hardened from green to gray-brown and thorns that could punch through leather gloves. Leander showed her the technique on a section of the North Arc. He selected a young stem growing at an angle, scored the underside with his knife, not cutting through, just breaking the bark and the outer wood, and bent it down and sideways until it lay across its neighbor's base. He wove it through the upright stems, pushing it under one and over the next, and tied it with a strip of willow bark. "You are making the hedge argue with itself," he said. "Every stem holds every other stem. The wind cannot take one without fighting all of them." Mara learned. She plashed 30 feet of the North Arc in a week, her hands torn open by thorns that found every gap in her wrapping. Willa, now 8, held the willow ties and handed them up when Mara called. By the end of the third growing season, the North and West arcs were woven tight, 6 to 9 feet tall in places, dense enough that Mara could not see through them at eye level, thorny enough that the cow that had broken through the young West row in 1885 no longer tried. But the hedge was uneven. The South Arc remained the weakest, and the east side had gaps where winterkill and grasshoppers had thinned the rows. The northwest corner, where the worst winter wind struck at an angle, had a section of poor growth where the soil was sandy and thin, and 3 years of effort had not closed it completely. Leander found the gap in the fall of 1887. He stood in it and felt the wind push through with barely any resistance. The stems on either side were 5 feet tall and woven tight. The gap was 8 feet wide. It was like a missing tooth in an otherwise complete jaw. "If the killing wind comes from the northwest," Leander said, "it will find this." "I know." "Can you close it before January?" Mara looked at the gap. She had transplanted into it 3 times. The soil rejected everything she planted. "I have brush. I can weave dead wood into the uprights and tie it with wire. Dead wood will hold for 1 storm, maybe 2. If the snow loads heavy, it will collapse. Then I will rebuild it after each storm." Leander did not argue. He helped her cut brush from the creek bottom and weave it into the gap. Dead willow, dried grass bundles, strips of bark, anything that would break the wind without being solid enough to catch a full drift. It was ugly. It was temporary. It was the best they could do. That night, an unexpected thing appeared on Mara's stoop. A burlap sack sat against the door, tied with the kind of knot a boy makes when he is in a hurry. Inside were 37 hedge apples, the green wrinkled fruits of Osage Orange, each one the size of a man's fist and full of seeds. A note written in a child's hand on brown paper said, "From east of Lincoln." Cora's oldest boy, Emmett, had a cousin in Lancaster County. The cousin had Osage orange trees growing along a fence row. The boy had collected the fruits, packed them in a feed sack, and sent them west by mail wagon. Mara split the fruits open the next morning and pressed the seeds into damp sand in the heel-in trench, the way Leander had taught her. 300 seeds, give or take. If half germinated in the spring, she would have enough to fill every gap in the circle. She carried the empty sack to Cora's cabin and set it on the stoop. Cora came to the door. "Emmett did that without asking," she said. "I know," Mara said. "I did not tell him to." "I know." Cora looked at her hands, which were wrapped in flour sack strips, with blood showing through at the knuckles. She opened her mouth, closed it, and went back inside. Mara walked home across the flat. The wind pushed against her back. The hedge was a dark, uneven line against the pale grass, and from a distance it looked like a scar on the earth. Not beautiful, not finished, but present. Real. Standing. December of 1887 arrived with hard snow, then a false thaw that turned the prairie to brown mud, then cold again. The hedge entered its first real winter as a structure rather than a row of seedlings. Mara watched it the way a shipbuilder watches a hull touch water for the first time. After a northwest blow in early December, she walked the circle with a measuring stick. a straight cottonwood branch marked in 6-inch intervals. On the windward side of the north arc, snow had piled 3 feet deep against the outer stems. The hedge had caught it, held it, forced the wind to drop its load before passing through. On the leeward side, between the hedge and the cabin, there were 6 inches of loose powder that had filtered through the gaps. 3 feet outside, 6 inches inside. The difference was visible, measurable, undeniable. The cattle noticed before Mara did. The 2 cows and a yearling calf she had raised from Cora's bull began bedding down inside the ring instead of crowding against the south wall of the cabin where they had always huddled. The interior of the circle was calmer, not warm, not still, but the wind that reached the yard had been broken into smaller gusts that could not find a sustained direction, and the animals' coats stayed dry instead of being scoured with driven snow. The stove held coals longer at night. Mara noticed it on the 3rd morning after the blow, when she woke and found the firebox still warm enough to light kindling without a match. She had not added more wood. The cabin was simply losing less heat. Emery Vale rode through in mid-December and saw the calm yard and the lack of drifts against the cabin door. He stood in his stirrups and looked at the hedge and at the snow piled against its outer face and at the clear ground within. His expression did not change. "A common blow is not a blizzard," he said. "Any sod wall will hold off a common blow." A sod wall would have collapsed under that snow load. Maybe, maybe not. He touched his hat and rode on. Cora began asking questions. She came to the cabin twice in December, both times with milk and both times with a reason that was not the real reason. How far from the house had Mara planted? How many rows? How tall did it need to be? What happened when a gap was too wide? She asked the questions the way a person asks directions to a place they are pretending they do not want to visit. Rafe Dorr heard that neighbors were beginning to pay attention to the hedge. His response was not agricultural. He sent word through the Broken Bow Bank that the Lorimer note would be called before February. $63 plus 18 months of accumulated interest. Mara calculated the total and found it exceeded $80. She had $49 in the coffee tin and $12 owed to her for sewing. She could not pay. Dorr knew she could not pay. The hedge had nothing to do with the debt, but the timing was not an accident. If Mara failed financially while succeeding practically, Dorr could take the claim and the hedge with it. Leander, who had stayed through December to check the plashing, warned Mara about trusting early victories. "A hedge can protect," he said, "but it can also trap snow if the openings are wrong. If a big storm loads the windward face faster than the gaps can drain, the whole structure becomes a drift wall and buries everything behind it." He made her cut a narrow leeward passage through the south arc, a gap wide enough for a person to pass through, angled away from the prevailing wind, and mark it on both sides with tall poles sunk deep enough to stand above any likely drift. "If you cannot find the way out," he said, "the hedge becomes a pen, not a shelter." The poles stood 8 feet tall, wrapped with strips of white cotton that would show against dark sky or pale snow. From inside the ring, they marked the exit like a doorway. From outside, they marked the way in. The year turned. January of 1888 arrived with moderate cold and clear skies. On the 11th, a warm front moved through, and the temperature rose to something that felt almost mild. Snow softened on the roof. Water dripped from the eaves. Willa went to the stoop without her heavy coat and stood in the sun with her face turned up, and for a moment the world felt merciful. On the morning of January 12th, Mara sent Willa to Cora Bessett's cabin for a spelling lesson with Cora's boys. The walk was half a mile across, open ground, a distance Willa covered twice a week following the fence line that ran between the two claims. The air was mild. The sky was clear. There was no reason to keep a child inside on a day like this. Leander was on the property checking the northwest gap where the dead brush and wire had held through December's blows, but was showing signs of loosening. He and Mara were tying fresh willow bundles into the weak section when the light changed. It did not happen slowly. The sky to the northwest went from pale blue to a color that had no name, a bruised gray-white that seemed to be moving toward them at the speed of a running horse. The temperature dropped so fast that Mara felt it on her teeth before she felt it on her skin. The wind, which had been gentle from the south, stopped. For 10 seconds, there was absolute stillness. Then the air reversed and came from the northwest like something released from a cage. The blizzard of January 12th, 1888 did not arrive as a snowfall. It arrived as a wall. The first thing Mara lost was sight. Visibility collapsed in less than a minute. The cabin, 50 feet away, disappeared. The hedge beside her became a dark suggestion, a shadow with thorns. The wind hit with a sound that was not a howl. It was a roar, a sustained physical pressure against her entire body that pushed her sideways and filled her nose and mouth with snow that was not falling, but flying, horizontal, driven like sand from a blast. The second thing she lost was her daughter. Willa was at Cora's cabin, half a mile away across open ground with no windbreak, no fence line to follow in the last 300 yards, and no shelter between here and there. The realization landed in Mara's chest like a fist. She turned toward the south, toward Cora's claim, and the wind threw her back. Leander grabbed her arm. He had to shout to be heard from 2 feet away. "You cannot walk into that. You will not make 50 yards. Willa is out there." "Willa is at Cora's cabin. Cora will keep her inside." What if they left? What if they were walking back? Leander did not answer because there was no good answer. If Willa and Cora's boys were caught between the two cabins, they were in the open with nothing to guide them and a wind that could kill a grown man in an hour. The third thing Mara lost was Leander's strength. He fell while helping her secure the gate poles on the south passage. The wind threw a loose branch from the hedge into his path, and he stumbled and pitched forward into the outer row of thorns. The Osage Orange caught him like a trap. Thorns punched through his coat and into his forearm, tearing a gash 6 inches long that opened to the muscle. He pulled free with a sound that the wind swallowed and pressed his arm against his body. Blood ran down his wrist and froze in red threads on his cuff before it reached his fingers. "Inside!" Mara shouted. She took his good arm and pulled him toward the cabin, using the hedge as a guide, her left hand trailing along the thorny stems, each contact a sting of pain that told her where she was. The cabin appeared out of the white as a dark shape. She pushed Leander through the door, and he collapsed against the wall, gray-faced, holding his arm. She could not stay inside. The northwest gap, the weak point, the section of dead brush and wire that had never been replaced with living wood, was directly in the path of the wind. If the wind found that gap at full force, it would pour through like water through a broken dam and drive snow straight at the cabin door. Everything the hedge was supposed to prevent would happen in the one place where the hedge was not complete. Mara wrapped Leander's arm with a strip of blanket, gave him a rag to press against the wound, and told him to stay with the stove. Then she went back outside. The wind hit her in the doorway, and she had to grab the frame with both hands to keep from being pushed back inside. Snow was already drifting against the south wall of the cabin, loose, wind-driven snow that the hedge had not caught because it was coming through the gaps at a speed the porous barrier could manage. But from the northwest she could hear a different sound, a sustained, high-pitched keening that meant the wind was finding a channel and accelerating through it. The gap. She could not see it. She could not see anything. She put her left hand on the hedge and began moving clockwise around the inner path, step by step, the thorns catching her sleeves and scoring her wrists through the fabric. The wind pushed against her back, then her side, then her face as she rounded the curve toward the northwest. Snow packed into her collar and melted against her neck. Her eyelashes froze together, and she had to pry them apart with her fingers. She found the gap by sound. The wind was screaming through it, a focused, concentrated blast that had found the 8-foot weakness and was driving through it with every pound of force the storm could deliver. Snow was pouring through the opening in a horizontal stream, building a drift tongue that was already 3 feet high and pointing directly at the cabin like a white finger. Mara dropped to her knees. She had brought a coil of wire, a bundle of willow withes, and the brush she and Leander had been tying when the storm hit. She could not see what she was doing. She worked by feel, pushing brush into the gap, weaving willow through the dead stems, twisting wire around the uprights with hands that had gone numb inside her gloves. The thorns of the living hedge on either side of the gap tore through her sleeves and opened cuts on her cheek and forearm. She bled into the snow and did not notice. She could not close the gap completely. She did not need to. She needed to break the channel, to turn the focused blast into diffuse turbulence that would drop its snow before it reached the house. She packed brush until the keening sound changed pitch from a scream to a moan, and the horizontal stream of snow hitting her face became a swirling, disorganized gust that could not find a direction. It was enough. She crawled back along the inner path to the cabin, guided by the hedge's thorns, and fell through the door. If you are invested in this story, stay with us and hit subscribe, because Mara has sealed the gap, but her daughter is still out there in the open, half a mile away, and what happens in the next hour is the difference between a shelter and a grave. The hedge performed, not perfectly, not magically, but it performed. Mara stood at the cabin's one window, a 12 by 16-inch piece of glass Thomas had freighted in from Broken Bow, and watched what the storm was doing to her circle of thorns. She could see perhaps 10 feet in any direction, no more, and what she saw was a war between wind and wood. The North Arc was taking the full force, snow piled against the outer face in a continuous rising wall, 3 feet, then 5, then something higher that she could not measure because the white erased the line between snow and sky. The hedge caught the drift and held it. The thorns and woven stems flexed under the weight, but did not break. The wind pushed through the porosity of the barrier, slowed, dropped its snow on the windward side, and arrived inside the circle as a diminished thing, a gust, not a gale. The snow that filtered through was loose and light, the kind that could be shoveled, not the packed, wind-driven crust that buried doors and smothered cattle. Outside the ring, the storm owned the prairie. Inside the ring, the stove drew well. The cattle stood with their backs to the hedge and their heads down, and the snow against the cabin door was less than a foot deep. But Willow was not inside the ring. Mara gave Leander water and checked his arm. The bleeding had slowed, but the gash was deep, and the skin around it was swelling red. He was pale, and his hands were shaking. He looked at Mara's face and saw what she was going to do. "You cannot go out there," he said. "My daughter is at Cora's. Cora will keep her. Cora's cabin has no windbreak, no hedge, nothing but 3 strands of wire and a sod wall on the north side. If the stove goes out, if the door drifts shut, if the boys panicked and ran, you do not know any of that. I know my daughter's not here." Leander closed his eyes. When he opened them, he said, "Use the poles, the passage poles. Follow them out and follow the hedge line east. You know where Cora's fence starts. If you lose the fence, you lie down and wait. Do not walk blind. The moment you cannot feel the wire, you stop. Mara pulled on Thomas's heavy coat, which hung to her knees and smelled of wood smoke and the ghost of a man who would never wear it again. She wrapped her face in a wool scarf until only her eyes showed. She took a length of rope and tied one end to the south passage pole and the other around her waist. She stepped out of the ring. The wind hit her like a hand. Outside the hedge, the world was white noise and white light and white cold that found every inch of exposed skin and began its work. She leaned into the gale and followed the rope to the outer edge of the drift, then released it and found Cora's fence line by stumbling into it. The top wire caught her across the chest, and she grabbed it with both hands and held on. She followed the wire east. The posts appeared one at a time, dark shapes in the white, each one a small victory. She counted them. She knew there were 14 posts between her claim and Cora's yard. At the 9th post, she heard something, a child crying. Not from Cora's cabin, from the open ground between the fence line and a shallow wash that ran south of the road. Mara left the wire and walked toward the sound, her hands out in front of her, her feet finding nothing but snow and more snow, and then she stumbled over something that moved. Cora was on the ground, huddled in the wash with her 2 boys and Willa pressed against her body. She had been trying to walk them home when the storm hit. She had followed a fence line that turned out to be the wrong one, a short run of wire around an abandoned hay lot, and when it ended, she had no direction left. She had put the children in the wash to get them below the wind and wrapped them in her coat and her apron, and was waiting for the storm to end or for someone to find them, or for neither. Willa's face was white, not cold white, fear white. She saw her mother's shape emerge from the storm and screamed a word that the wind tore away. Mara pulled the children up. She made Cora grab the hem of Thomas's coat. She made Cora's boys each hold a handful of Cora's skirt. She led them back the way she had come, step by step, until she found the fence wire, and then she followed it west, counting posts. At the 14th post, she turned south and found the hedge by walking into it. The thorns raked her face, and she laughed, a sound so strange in the storm that Cora flinched, because the pain meant she was home. She followed the hedge line to the marked passage, found the poles by their white cotton strips barely visible in the driving white, and led them through. Inside the ring, the wind dropped. The sound changed from a roar to a muffled rush, as if someone had closed a heavy door. The children stopped crying. The cattle lifted their heads and looked at the newcomers with the dull patience of animals that had been comfortable for hours. Mara brought them inside the cabin. 5 people in a room 16 feet by 12. Leander by the stove with his wrapped arm. Cora's boys shaking and silent. Cora herself staring at the walls as if she had never seen a house before. And Willa pressed against her mother's chest, breathing in small, fast gulps that slowly, slowly steadied. The stove door glowed red. The cabin held its warmth. Outside the hedge, the blizzard raged for 14 more hours, and the wind that had killed across the open prairie spent itself tearing at branches 50 feet from the walls. Across the county, the storm was not kind. Emery Vale tried to reach a neighbor's barn, a quarter-mile from his house. He lost the fence line in the first 200 yards and wandered in a circle for an hour before his dog found him and led him back by barking from the porch. His hands were white to the wrists, and his left ear would never feel heat again. Rafe Door's hired man, Jory Pell, tried to move cattle away from a wire fence where they were piling up and smothering. He made it 200 yards into the open, and the wind stripped the hat from his head and the gloves from his hands. They found him the next morning against a fence post with his fingers frozen into claws that would not straighten for weeks. A family named Dalgard, 7 miles north, lost their entire cabin when the sod roof collapsed under the snow load. The husband dug his wife and 3 children out from under the debris and walked them to a neighbor's dugout. The youngest child, a boy of 2, did not survive the walk. A cattle herd belonging to a rancher west of the Lou drifted into a coulee during the worst of the wind and piled against a cut bank. 83 head smothered in the snow. The rancher found them in the spring, stacked like cordwood, still frozen. The storm killed across the open plains because the open plains had nothing to stop it. No barriers, no brakes, no structures between the wind and the things the wind could reach. It was not the coldest storm in Nebraska memory. It was the fastest, warm morning to killing blizzard in less than an hour, and the openness of the land turned speed into slaughter. Inside the ring of thorns, the stove burned. The children slept. The wind outside the hedge screamed itself hoarse against the branches and spent its force on wood instead of flesh. Dawn came gray and slow. The wind died in pieces, like a fire burning down. Mara opened the cabin door and looked out at a world remade in white. The hedge had caught so much snow that the north and west arcs had become a wall, not of thorns, but of drift, 10 feet high in places, 5 feet in others, packed hard by the wind. The interior of the ring was a pocket of relative calm. Less than a foot of loose snow lay against the cabin door. The cattle were alive, standing in the yard, breathing steam. Beyond the hedge, the prairie was scoured and drifted in alternating strips. Bare ground where the wind had stripped the snow, 10-foot ridges where it had piled. Nothing moved. No smoke rose from any chimney Mara could see. Then, from beyond the drift wall, she heard men shouting. The men who came were not a rescue party. They were neighbors checking the living from the dead. Halvor Stain arrived first. On snowshoes he had carved from barrel staves and rawhide, his beard frozen into a single white plank. Behind him came Orrin Bessett, Cora's husband, who had spent the night in his own cabin, believing his wife and children were still at the Lorimer place and had set out at first light to find them. His face, when Cora opened the door and he saw his boys alive, went through a sequence of expressions that belonged to no single word. Mara did not have time for reunions. She took the shovel and the butcher knife and cut a passage through the drift on the north side of the hedge. The snow was packed so hard she had to chop it in blocks, each one dense as wet clay. The passage opened into a trench between the drift wall and the outer stems of the hedge, and from there she could see the prairie beyond. The drift along the north and west arcs rose higher than a man. In places it was 10 feet high, a solid ridge of wind-packed snow that had been caught, held, and deposited by the thorns. The hedge itself was buried to its upper branches, the woven stems visible only where the wind had scoured a gap between snowpack and wood. But the structure had held. The plashed and interwoven branches had not broken under the load. They had flexed, absorbed, and anchored the drift in place. Beyond the ridge, the prairie was a landscape of violence. Drifts and bare ground alternated in long stripes aligned with the wind. A neighbor's cabin to the northwest showed a door buried to the lintel. Another, farther out, had no smoke rising from its chimney. Men began arriving through the morning. They climbed the drift wall to look down into Mara's yard, and what they saw stopped them one by one. Live cattle standing in a clear space, a smoking chimney, a door with less than a foot of snow against it. Children's voices inside. The contrast with what they had just walked through, open ground where the storm had killed with impunity, was visible and immediate and impossible to explain away. Emery Vale came last. He came on foot because his horse would not cross the drifts. He climbed the north ridge with his bad ear wrapped in a wool strip and his frost-bitten hands tucked under his arms. He stood on top of the drift and looked down into the yard and did not speak for a long time. Mara was below, shoveling the passage wider. She saw him standing there, a dark shape against the white sky, the county's stock inspector who had told her 2.5 years ago that a woman alone could not keep the wind from eating the house. "Come down," she said. Emery climbed down. He stood in the yard and looked at the cattle, the clear door, the smoking chimney, the drift wall rising on every side. He looked at the hedge, what he could see of it above the snow, and at the plashed stems and the willow ties and the thorns and the woven branches that had caught 10,000 pounds of wind-driven snow and held it 50 feet from the walls. "Your stove is burning," he said. "It burned all night. I used less wood than a normal January night because the draft was not pulling heat out of the cabin." Less wood. The wind could not reach the stovepipe seams. It could not push through the door gaps. The hedge did not make heat. It stopped the wind from stealing it. Emery looked at the ground. He looked at his own hands, the left one swollen to twice its size, the fingertips blackened at the edges where the frost had done its work. He had nearly died last night trying to reach a neighbor's barn across 200 yards of open ground, 200 yards without a windbreak, 200 yards that the wind had turned into a killing field. "I told you a fence could not warm a stove," Emery said. His voice was quieter than Mara had ever heard it. "I was wrong. It kept the stove from being robbed." He did not look at her when he said it. He looked at the hedge, and then he asked a question that Emery Vale had never asked anyone about anything in 31 years on the Nebraska prairie. "How far from the walls did you plant?" 50 feet. "Why 50? "Far enough for the wind to slow down after passing through, close enough to maintain." Emery nodded once. He climbed back up the drift and walked away across the white, and Mara watched him go with a feeling she could not name, not triumph, not satisfaction, something quieter and stranger, like watching a door open that had been locked so long she had forgotten it was there. Cora's conversion was not a single moment. It was a process that had begun with the hedge apples and continued through the night of the blizzard, when she lay in Mara's cabin with her children alive around her and listened to the wind failing against the thorns outside. She came back 3 days after the storm, alone, without milk. She walked the inner path of the hedge circle, the narrow track between the buried outer rows and the cabin yard, and she touched the stems where they emerged from the snowpack. She counted rows. She measured distances with her boot heel. She asked questions she had never asked before. Not skeptical questions, not challenging questions, but practical ones. "If I plant along the north and west sides of our cabin, how many rows?" 2 minimum. 3 is better." "How far from the wall?" "At least 30 feet. 40 is better if you have the ground." "How long before it works?" 3 years before it holds a real wind. 2 if you plash early and the growth is strong." Cora looked at the drift wall. She looked at the clear yard. She looked at the cabin door, which she could open without a shovel. "Emmett can dig holes," she said. "He is 12 and he has more energy than sense. I can set plants. Orrin will not help. Orrin thinks this is witchcraft." "Orrin does not have to help. Orrin just has to not trample the seedlings." Cora almost smiled. It was the closest thing to warmth Mara had seen from her in 3 years of neighboring. Within a week, 4 families had come to Mara's cabin to see the hedge and ask how it worked. Halvorstein, who could not discuss the physics in English, brought his wife to translate and spent an hour walking the rows, bending down to examine the plashing, running his hand along the woven stems with the expression of a man studying a piece of fine joinery. A widow named Alma Prager, who lived alone on a quarter section east of the Bassett claim, arrived with a list of questions written on the back of a seed catalog. How deep did the roots go? Could she plant in sandy soil? What happened if grasshoppers ate the leaves? Mara answered everything. She drew circles and straight windward lines in flour on her kitchen table, the white powder standing in for snow. She showed them where the drift formed, where the calm pocket sat, where the passage needed to be. Leander, sitting by the stove with his arm wrapped in his face still gray, corrected her spacing measurements with a trembling finger. Not 12 inches, he said, his voice thin. 18. 12 grows too tight. The wind hits a solid face and goes over. You need gaps. The gaps are what make it work. The distinction mattered. A cattle hedge and a snow hedge were different things. A cattle hedge needed to be impenetrable, dense, low, thorny enough that no animal would push through. A snow hedge needed controlled porosity, gaps that let the wind pass through at reduced speed, dropping its snow load on the windward side instead of building drifts against whatever sat behind it. Mara understood this now, with the precision of someone who had staked her life on the difference. Do not plant tight, she told every visitor. Plant loose. Leave room for the wind to argue with the branches. If you make a wall, the wind goes over and comes down behind you just as hard. If you make a screen, the wind comes through tired. Not everyone listened. Not everyone would. Rafe Dorr's reaction to the blizzard's aftermath was not conversion. It was calculation. He rode through 2 days after the storm broke, surveying losses. His outfit had suffered. Jory Pell's frostbitten hands would keep him off a horse for weeks. 18 head of cattle had smothered against a wire fence on the East Range. His hay stores were intact, but the access road was drifted shut, and he had hired 2 men from town to dig it open. He stopped his horse on the road and looked at the Lorimer hedge from a distance. The drift wall, the clear yard, the smoke rising from the chimney. He looked at it the way a man looks at a card he did not expect another player to hold. He did not visit. He did not congratulate. He rode to Broken Bow and told the men at the freight office that the storm had spared Mara Lorimer's cabin by luck. A freak of terrain, a quirk of the draw, nothing repeatable and nothing worth copying. The story was plausible enough. Weather on the plains was local and unpredictable. A cabin in one spot might escape what a cabin 300 yards away could not. But the men at the freight office had also heard Halvor Steen's account, delivered through his wife's translation with the enthusiasm of a man who had seen something he could not explain away. And they had heard Emery Vale's account, which was more devastating to Dorr's version because Emery had spent 31 years being right about the plains and had just admitted he was wrong about one specific thing. Dorr felt the ground shifting. If Mara's method spread, the settlers he had spent years squeezing through winter debt would hold their claims longer. They would survive the storms that were supposed to drive them out. They would keep the livestock that was supposed to become his at auction prices. His business model: buy distressed claims, acquire weakened herds, lend against failure, depended on the prairie winning. If people learned to make the prairie lose, Dorr lost with it. He said nothing more about the hedge publicly, but within a month he began buying Osage Orange seedlings from every nursery wagon that passed through Custer County, not to plant them, to keep others from getting them. Leander's arm did not heal. The gash from the hedge thorns had been deep, and the cold had driven dirt and bark fragments into the wound before Mara could clean it. By the end of January, the skin around the cut was red and hot to the touch, and the swelling had spread from his forearm to his elbow. Mara washed the wound with boiled water and packed it with a poultice of yarrow and clean linen, but she was not a doctor, and the infection was not listening to prairie medicine. Leander bore it the way he bore everything, quietly, with an economy of complaint that made the pain harder to watch. He sat by the stove and sharpened his pruning knife with a whetstone, the blade moving back and forth in a rhythm that had not changed in 40 years. He told Willa how to graft an apple scion onto a wild rootstock using a split stick and a piece of string to demonstrate. He drew hedge designs in the margins of an almanac with a pencil stub, marking optimal distances and angles for different wind exposures. He and Mara worked together at the table in the evenings, planning the next season's improvements. The Northwest Gap needed permanent repair. Living wood, not brush. The South Arc needed thickening. The east side had 3 sections where the plashing had not held, and the stems had sprung apart, leaving windows that a determined wind could exploit. "You understand something most people never learn," Leander said one evening, looking at the drawings spread across the table. "You understand that a barrier is not a wall. A wall fights the wind. A barrier negotiates with it." "You taught me that." "No, I taught you technique. The understanding was yours before I arrived. A cooper's daughter." He smiled, and the smile faded into a wince as his arm shifted against the table. "I have sold nursery stock to 100 farmers. 3 of them understood why their trees died. You are the only one who understood why the wind matters more than the tree." In February, the infection reached his blood. His skin went yellow, his eyes dulled. He stopped sharpening the knife and sat with it in his lap, turning it over in his fingers like a letter he had read too many times. Mara sent Cora's boy to Broken Bow for a doctor, but the roads were still half drifted, and the doctor did not come for 4 days. By then Leander's fever was high enough that he spoke in German and did not recognize the cabin. The doctor, a young man from Ohio who had been in Nebraska less than a year, looked at the arm and said the word that meant there was nothing left to try. Leander died on a Thursday in late February of 1888, 6 weeks after the blizzard. He died in Mara's cabin, in the bed where Willa usually slept, with the pruning knife on the blanket beside his hand. His last coherent words spoken to Mara the day before were not about the hedge. "Do not make disciples," he said. His voice was a whisper that she had to lean close to hear. "Make people who can see wind." Mara buried him beside Thomas, in ground that was frozen again and had to be broken with the same borrowed pick. She wrapped the pruning knife in oilcloth and hung it on the wall beside the stove, where it would stay for the rest of her life. She did not cry at the burial. She cried that night, alone, after Willa was asleep, sitting on the stoop with her back against the doorframe and her face turned toward the hedge. The thorns were black against the stars. The wind moved through them with a sound that was almost gentle, a whisper, a negotiation, the air arriving on the far side with its force spent and its snow already fallen. Leander had shown her where to cut. The hedge was hers. Spring of 1888 came late and grudging. The snow did not fully clear until April, and when it melted, the ground beneath the hedgerows was black with moisture that the drift had delivered slowly over weeks, a deep, patient soaking that the roots drank through March and April, and that pushed the spring growth harder than any watering Mara could have managed. The hedge, which had been 6 to 9 feet in the fall, pushed new shoots that added 2 feet by June. The plashed sections thickened. The woven stems, compressed by the winter's snow load, had bonded in places where bent wood had rooted into the ground and sent up new vertical growth. The hedge was becoming what Leander had promised. Not a row of plants, but a single organism, each stem holding every other, the thorns interlocking, the branches weaving themselves tighter with every season. Mara organized the first hedge day in May. She invited Cora, Halvor Steen, Alma Prager, and 2 other families who had asked about the method. They gathered at the Lorimer claim on a Saturday with shovels, buckets, and the suspicious goodwill of people who had survived something terrible and were willing to try something strange. Mara taught through demonstration, the way Leander had taught her. She showed them how to heel in seedlings in wet sand. She showed them how to cut the leader low and force side growth. She showed them how to measure the distance from the structure they wanted to protect, 30 feet minimum, 50 if the ground allowed, and how to mark the prevailing wind direction by the lean of the grass and the pattern of old snowtails behind posts. If this story reminds you why preparation matters more than luck, share it with someone who needs to hear it before their own storm arrives. She drew the plashing technique in the dirt with a stick, bend, score, weave, tie, and then walked to the north arc and demonstrated on a living stem, her scarred hands moving through the thorns with the ease of long practice. Halvor watched her hands and nodded. Alma wrote in her seed catalog. Cora's boy Emmett dug holes with more enthusiasm than precision, and Mara corrected his spacing 3 times without raising her voice. By the end of the day, they had planted the first 40 yards of Cora's north hedge, 2 rows of Osage Orange, 18 inches apart, set 35 feet from the Bessett cabin's north wall. It was the beginning. Cora stood at the end of the row and looked at the small green shoots and said nothing, but her hand rested on the nearest stake the way a person's hand rests on something they have decided to trust. Dor's seedling buying did not go unnoticed. Sutter mentioned it to Mara in June. Dor's man came through last week and bought every bundle I had. Paid full price, did not haggle. He asked if I had more coming, and I said August, and he said he would take those too. He is not planting them. No, he is not planting anything. He is storing them in his hay barn, and I expect they are dying in the dark. Sutter shrugged. It is his money. The meaning was clear. If Dor controlled the seedling supply, the neighbors who wanted to plant could not get stock. They would have to grow from seed, a process that added a full year to the timeline, or find sources outside the county, which meant freight costs that most homesteaders could not afford. Mara's response was practical. She walked her hedgerows and collected every rootsucker she could spare without weakening the parent plants. She split hedge apples from the fall crop and started seed beds in the shelter of the East Arc. She asked Cora's nephew in Lancaster County to send more fruit in the autumn. By July, she had 200 seedlings growing in a nursery bed inside the ring, each one a potential section of someone else's windbreak. Dor could buy every seedling in Custer County. He could not buy the ones growing in Mara's yard, but Dor was not finished. In August, he sent word through the Broken Bow Bank that the Lorimer note was in default and that he intended to file for a sheriff's sale of the claim before harvest. The interest had accumulated to $22. The total debt stood at $85. Mara had $61 in the coffee tin, more than she had ever saved, thanks to sewing income and the sale of surplus milk, but not enough to clear the note. The debt was a weapon, and Dor was pointing it at the one thing the hedge could not protect. The secondary crisis came in late February of 1889, and it came for Cora. A calving storm swept through Custer County on a night when Cora had 3 heifers due and her new hedge was only 8 months in the ground, knee-high, thin, useless against serious wind. The storm was not a blizzard. It was a sustained northwest blow with wet snow and temperatures that hovered just below freezing, warm enough to keep the snow heavy, cold enough to kill a newborn calf in 30 minutes. Cora sent Emmett running to Mara's cabin at dusk. The boy arrived with snow on his shoulders and panic in his eyes. The calves are coming, and Ma says the wind is going to kill them before they can stand. Mara did not have Leander. She did not have time. She had the principle. She loaded the cart with hay bales, a bundle of brush cut from the creek bottom, and a coil of wire. She took the lame mare, whose hock had finally healed enough for light work, and drove to Cora's claim in the dark. The hedge Cora had planted was too small to matter. 8 months of growth had produced stems barely 2 feet tall, no thicker than a finger, with no plashing and no density. The wind walked through them without slowing. Mara looked at the calving pen. 3 strands of wire around a trampled square of mud, and looked at the wind direction and did not hesitate. She built a temporary barrier. She stacked hay bales in a V shape on the northwest side of the pen, angled so that the open end of the V faced the wind and the point aimed away from the calves. She wove brush panels between the bales, filling the gaps with dead willow and grass bundles tied with wire. She left spaces between each panel, deliberate gaps, 6 inches wide, that broke the wind into smaller streams without stopping it completely. The same principle: porous, not solid. Break the force, do not block it. Cora watched from inside the pen, crouched beside a heifer that was already laboring. "That will not hold," she said. "It does not need to hold. It needs to slow the wind for one night." The first calf was born at midnight into a pocket of relative calm behind the hay and brush V. The wind still reached the pen, but it arrived broken, scattered, without the concentrated force that could strip heat from a wet newborn in minutes. Mara rubbed the calf dry with burlap sacking and pushed it toward the heifer's flank. The second calf came at 2 in the morning, the third at dawn. All 3 lived. Across the county, calving losses that night ran between 30 and 50%. Wet snow, steady wind, and no shelter. The math was the same math it had always been. The wind takes the heat, the cold finishes the job. Cora lost nothing. Her pen was crude, temporary, ugly. But it worked because the principle worked. And the principle did not require 3 years of growth or 750 plants. It required understanding where the wind was going and giving it something to argue with before it arrived. Word spread faster than Mara expected. By March, 2 more families had asked her to help design temporary calving shelters. By April, Halvor Stein had extended his north hedge and added a brush and bale V to his sheep pen. By May, Alma Prager had planted 3 rows along her west boundary and was trimming leaders with a knife she had sharpened on a creek stone, the way Mara had shown her. The method was moving, not because Mara promoted it, because the storms kept coming and the open prairie kept killing, and the people who had seen the inside of Mara's hedge ring during the blizzard of '88 could not forget the difference between that calm yard and the white death beyond the thorns. Rafe Dorr tried to kill the method with a lie. In April of 1889, a rancher named Collier, who had a place 12 miles south, lost 6 calves during a spring blow. Collier had tried to copy Mara's V-shelter design, but he had built it wrong: solid hay bales with no gaps, stacked in a straight wall instead of a V. The wind had hit the solid face, vaulted over the top, and curled down behind the wall with enough force to scour snow into the pen from the leeward side. The calves had been buried, not sheltered. Dorr heard about the loss and turned it into ammunition. He told every man who would listen that Mara Lorimer's advice had killed Collier's calves. He told it at the freight office, at Sutter's store, at the stockyard in Broken Bow. He said it with the same patient, reasonable smile he had used when he offered Mara $73 for her claim. "She tells people to build walls of hay, and the wind does what wind does," Dorr said. "She's not a builder. She is not an engineer. She's a widow with a weed fence and a story." The accusation reached Mara through Cora, who delivered it with a fury Mara had not seen from her before. "He is saying you killed those calves." Did Collier build gaps in his wall? No. Did he angle it into a V? He built a straight line of solid bales. Then he did not build what I taught. He built a wall. A wall does what Leander told me a wall does. It throws the wind over, and the wind comes down behind it. Mara did not wait for the story to harden. She drove to Broken Bow on a market day when the freight office was full, and she stood in the doorway and spoke in a voice that carried to every corner. "Mr. Dorr says my advice killed calves," she said. "I would like to hear him say it to my face, and then explain why Cora Bessett's 3 calves lived on the same night, using the same method, while Mr. Collier built a solid wall with no gaps and no angle and blamed me when the wind did exactly what a solid wall makes wind do." The room was quiet. Dorr was standing by the window with a cup of coffee in his hand. He did not move. "The method is not a wall," Mara said. "The method is a screen. It has gaps. The gaps matter. If you close the gaps, you build a dam, and the wind goes over the dam and destroys what is behind it. If you leave the gaps, the wind passes through, tired, and drops its snow before it reaches your stock." She looked directly at Dorr. "Mr. Collier did not use my method. He used his own. If Mr. Dorr wants to explain the difference, I will wait." Dorr set down his coffee. "I have no quarrel with you, Mrs. Lorimer." "You have a quarrel with my hedge. You have had one since the day you offered me $73 for a claim worth $600. The room was still quiet. Men looked at Dorr. Men looked at Mara. The silence had a weight to it that pressed against the walls. Dorr left without speaking again. He did not retract his claim about Collier's calves, but he did not repeat it either, because the men in the freight office had seen Mara's face when she said the word gaps, and they had understood something that Dorr's version of the story had not contained. The method was specific. It was precise. It was not a folk remedy or a widow's luck. It was knowledge, the kind that worked when you used it correctly and failed when you did not, like any real thing. Gideon Amsbury arrived in Custer County in the spring of 1889, and he arrived with a surveyor's chain and a school teacher's patience and absolutely no knowledge of Osage Orange. He was 34, widowed. His wife had died of typhoid in Grand Island 2 years earlier, and he had come west to teach school and earn survey fees on the side, because a teacher's salary in Nebraska bought less than a teacher's pride required. He was lean and quiet, with a habit of measuring things before speaking about them, and he wore spectacles that he cleaned on his shirt tail 6 times a day, whether they were dirty or not. He met Mara because Alma Prager asked him to survey the boundary of her west hedge line, and when he saw the planting, he asked questions, not about whether it worked, about the geometry, how far from the structure, what angle to the prevailing wind, how did the distance between rows affect the porosity. Mara answered with the patience of a woman who had answered these questions 50 times. Gideon listened with the focus of a man who processed information by writing it down. He took notes in a pocket ledger with a pencil so short it disappeared in his fingers. "You are doing trigonometry," he said after she explained the offset rows. "I am planting hedge." "You are planting hedge using trigonometric principles, whether you call it that or not. The angle of offset, the ratio of gap to stem, the relationship between barrier height and protected distance, these are calculable. They are also plantable, which is what matters." Gideon smiled. It was a specific smile, not the condescending amusement of a man who thinks he knows more, but the genuine pleasure of a person encountering competence in unexpected form. He offered to help neighbors measure distances and prevailing wind lines. Mara accepted, because her eye for distance was good, but a surveyor's chain was better, and because Gideon did not treat the work as charity. He treated it as interesting. They argued about written plans. Gideon believed every hedge design should be drawn on paper with measurements and angles before a single hole was dug. Mara believed that paper was for people who had never knelt in the dirt and felt which way the wind pushed the grass. "You cannot teach by feel," Gideon said. "If this method spreads beyond people, you personally walk through the process. It needs documentation." Documentation is a fancy word for instructions that people follow instead of think. Instructions save the people who come after the teacher is gone. Mara looked at him sharply. The sentence had landed closer to Leander than Gideon could have known. She did not answer. She picked up a stake and walked to the next mark on Alma's boundary line, and Gideon followed with his chain and his ledger and said nothing more about it that day. But he came back, and the next time he brought string and a protractor and measured the angle between Mara's north arc and the prevailing winter wind, and the number he wrote down was close enough to what Leander had taught her by feel that Mara stood looking at the ledger for a long time and did not speak. The courtship, if that was the word, happened through stakes and string and measurements and shared silence over hedgerows in the evening light. It was not romance. It was work, done beside someone whose presence made the work feel less like survival and more like building. But that was months away from meaning anything, and Mara had a debt to settle and a seedling supply to protect, and a method to defend against a man who smiled while he waited for her to fail. Rafe Dorr had announced through the bank that he intended to force a sheriff's sale before harvest. The note plus interest stood at $85. Mara had 61. The gap was $24, a sum she could earn by September if she sewed every night and sold every surplus egg and pint of milk. But September was 5 months away, and Dorr was not required to wait. The hedge could stop the wind. It could not stop a man with a lawyer and a ledger. The sheriff's sale never happened. It did not happen because of Emery Vale, who had spent 31 years saying nothing about other people's financial business, and who broke that habit on a Tuesday afternoon in the Broken Bow courthouse. He walked into the county clerk's office, set his hat on the counter, and asked to see the Lorimer note. The clerk, a man named Peel who owed his appointment to relationships that included Rafe Dorr's cattle money, produced the document. Emery read it slowly, holding the page at arm's length because his eyes were not what they had been. He read it again. Then he pointed to a clause that specified the interest rate and said, "This exceeds the territorial limit." Nebraska had a usury statute. The rate Dorr had written into Thomas Lorimer's note, compounded monthly, applied retroactively to the original balance, exceeded the legal maximum by a margin that was either carelessness or confidence that a grieving widow would never read the terms. Emery had read them. He had read them because a man who admits he was wrong about one thing becomes dangerous. He starts looking at everything else with the same skeptical eye that should have been there all along. The clerk studied the clause. He looked at Emery. He looked at the door, as if hoping someone might walk through it and resolve this quietly. No one appeared. "The accumulated interest is void," Emery said. "The principal stands at $63. Mrs. Lorimer has 61. I expect she can manage $2 more." Mara paid the note in full the following week. $63 counted out in coins and small bills on Peel's counter, the last $2 borrowed from Cora Bessett, who handed them over without being asked and without expecting them back. Peel stamped the document and folded it and passed it across the counter without comment. Mara carried it home in her coat pocket, feeling the weight of it against her hip the entire walk, and when she reached the cabin, she fed it into the stove and watched it curl and blacken and dissolve into ash that held no shape and carried no power. The debt was gone. The claim was hers, free, clear, proved, and the only thing standing on it that Rafe Dorr had any remaining interest in was a circle of thorns that was making his way of doing business harder every year. Dorr's reckoning came in the winter of 1890, and it arrived not through a confrontation Mara engineered, but through the prairie doing what the prairie has always done to men who believe they can ignore it. He had refused to plant a hedge. The refusal was not practical. He had land, labor, and a barn full of hoarded seedlings drying in the dark. The refusal was structural. It was built into the architecture of who Rafe Dorr understood himself to be. Planting a hedge meant admitting, publicly and permanently, that a method he had mocked for 6 years worked. It meant admitting that a widow with a shovel and a cooper's memory had understood something about the Nebraska wind that a man with 4,000 acres and 30 years of cattle money had not. A man can survive being wrong in private. Being wrong in public, on the plains, costs a kind of authority that cannot be repurchased. So when the February storm of 1890 hit his east range, sustained northwest gale, driving snow, temperature falling from mild to brutal in 3 hours, his cattle did what cattle do in open country. They turned their backs to the wind and walked. They walked with the gale pushing them because that is the only direction a cow can face in a blizzard, and they walked until they met the first obstacle, which was 3 strands of barbed wire strung tight between cedar posts. The wire held. The cattle could not pass through. The wind did not stop. The animals behind pushed the animals in front against the wire, and the snow covered them where they stood, layer upon layer, drift upon drift, the wind packing it dense as clay around legs and bellies and necks. 41 head. Dead not from cold alone, but from the geometry of open ground and a barrier that stopped bodies while stopping nothing else. The wire held cattle. It did not hold wind. It did not hold snow. It held the animals in place while the storm buried them. They found the bodies in a line along the fence after the wind broke. 41 dark shapes in a white wall, half buried, frozen in postures of attempted escape, some still standing upright with their heads locked in ice at the level of the top wire. Dorr came to Mara's cabin at dusk on the second day. He rode the bay horse, but he sat differently in the saddle. The posture was not the patient confidence of a man who knows that time is on his side. It was the posture of a man carrying a weight he had not expected and could not shift. Behind him on the road, strung out in a bawling, gaunt procession, came his surviving east herd Fan Griam, 37 head, driven by Jory Pell on a sorrel and a hired boy from town on a mule. The cattle moved slowly. Their coats were matted with ice. Their eyes had the glazed look of animals that have been frightened for too long. Dorr stopped at the south passage of the hedge and looked at the marked poles with their white cotton strips. He looked through the passage at the calm yard inside the ring, the clear ground, the smoke rising straight from the chimney, Mara's cattle standing unbothered with frost on their backs, but no wind in their faces. He did not dismount. Mara came out of the cabin and stood in the passage with her arms at her sides. The wind pushed past her from the north, broken by the hedge into gusts that could not find a sustained direction. "I need to put these cattle behind your north shelter," Dorr said. "My range has no cover. Yours does." Mara looked at him. She looked at the cattle. She looked at Jory Pell, whose hands had healed from the blizzard of '88, but whose fingers still curled inward at rest, the tendons shortened by frost in a permanent reminder of what open ground costs. She looked at the boy from town, who was 14 and shivering, and did not care about the history between these two people. "Say the need plainly," Mara said. Dorr's jaw moved. The muscles along his cheekbone tightened and released and tightened again. Jory Pell was watching from the saddle. The boy was watching. Cora's son Emmett, who had been helping Mara stack firewood from the hedge pruning pile, was watching from beside the cabin with an armload of Osage branches still in his hands. "I am asking you to shelter my cattle behind your hedge," Dorr said. His voice was level, controlled, stripped of everything except the words. "Because I have no windbreak, and you do." Why do you have no windbreak, Mr. Dorr? The silence that followed was long enough for the wind to shift and push a gust of fine snow between them. Dorr's horse turned its head from the cold. Dorr did not. Because I did not build one, he said, because I did not believe it would matter. Mara opened the south passage. The cattle filed through, slowly, one by one, their hooves crunching on the packed snow of the path. They entered the ring and spread across the yard, finding the calm air, dropping their heads, settling into the windless pocket with the relief of animals that have stopped fighting something they cannot beat. The hedge caught the gale above them, and the snow fell on the outer face, and the yard stayed clear. Dorr sat on his horse and watched. He watched for a long time. Then he said, without looking at Mara, without looking at anyone, "Your weed fence holds better than my wire." It was not an apology. It was not warmth or generosity or transformation. It was the most that Rafe Dorr was capable of giving, a statement of fact delivered in the same flat, practical tone he used for cattle prices and land assessments. Mara accepted it the way she accepted the wind, as a feature of the landscape that could be worked with but not changed. He rode away that evening. His cattle stayed behind the hedge for 3 days until the storm broke. When Jory Pell came to collect them, he tipped his hat to Mara and said, "Thank you, ma'am," with the careful formality of a man speaking on behalf of someone who could not bring himself to say it. Dorr did not become kind. He did not become a neighbor, but he stopped buying seedlings to keep them from others. And when Willa Lorimer, 11 years old, stood up at a county meeting and asked whether school children should have to find their way home in a blizzard by luck, Dorr sent word through Sutter's store that he would pay for seedlings for a schoolyard hedge. He did not say Mara's name. He did not need to. The schoolyard hedge went in on a Saturday in May of 1890, and it was the first time the method belonged to someone other than Mara. 14 children helped dig holes. Gideon Amsbury measured the distances with his surveyor's chain and marked the rows with string and stakes. Cora brought water in a barrel on Orrin's wagon, and Orrin, who had never touched a seedling and still considered the entire enterprise suspicious, drove the wagon without complaint because his wife had stopped asking his opinion about hedges 2 years earlier. Mara supervised, but Willa taught. She stood at the head of each row with a bundle of seedlings in her arms and explained the spacing. 18 inches between plants, 18 inches between rows, the middle row offset so the gaps never aligned. She explained the distance, 40 feet from the schoolhouse wall, far enough for the wind to slow after passing through, close enough for the children to reach the building from any direction by following the hedge line. She explained the passage, marked with tall poles on the south corner, angled away from the prevailing northwest wind, wide enough for a teacher leading 6 children by the hand. She explained everything in language that did not require a surveyor's chain or a barrel maker's memory or a Swiss nurseryman's scarred hands. She explained it the way a person explains something they have known for as long as they can remember, not as information, but as a fact of the world, like weather or gravity. She was the first person who could teach the hedge method without saying, "My mother says." Mara watched from the edge of the planting and felt something she had not expected. Not pride, or not only pride, relief. The method had left her hands. It existed now in someone who would carry it forward without needing Mara to be present, the way a fire carries itself from one piece of wood to the next, without needing the match that started it. Leander had told her not to make disciples. She had not. She had made a daughter who could see wind. By 1892, the Lorimer hedge ring stood 12 feet at its tallest point along the north arc, the plashed and woven stems grown so dense that a man could lean his full weight against them without shifting the wall. The thorns had become architectural, hard, curved, dark as iron nails, each one capable of puncturing boot leather. Birds nested in the upper branches. Rabbits burrowed at the base. A family of barn owls hunted from the tallest growth on the west arc, and their pellets collected at the roots like small gray offerings. The cabin had expanded. Gideon had helped frame an addition on the south side, a room for Willa, a room for books, a porch where Mara could sit in the evening and watch the hedge line darken against the sky. A root cellar kept vegetables through the winter. A henhouse held 12 birds. A milking shed with a shake roof stood inside the ring near the east arc. And in the calmest pocket, between the south hedge and the cabin, 4 apple trees and 2 plum trees grew from rootstock that Mara had grafted using the technique Leander had taught Willa with a split stick and a piece of string. The orchard would not have survived on the open plain. Unprotected fruit trees on the high plains lose their blossom wood to winter wind and their new growth to late frost driven by spring gales. Inside the ring, the air moved gently enough that blossoms held and fruit set, and by the 3rd year, the apple trees bore enough that Mara traded surplus fruit for flour and cloth at Sutter's store. She had not planned an orchard. The hedge had created conditions she had not anticipated, and she had recognized the opportunity the way she recognized everything on this claim by watching what happened and responding to it. Osage Orange wood from the annual pruning became the best fuel on the property. It burned hotter and longer than any other wood available in Custer County, hotter than elm, hotter than ash, immeasurably hotter than the cottonwood she had started with 8 years earlier. A single Osage log held coals through the night. The same wood, split and shaped, made tool handles that lasted a generation, fence posts that resisted rot for decades, and wagon pins that Gideon sold to freighters at $1 apiece. The hedge produced shelter, fuel, building material, and the conditions for an orchard. It cost nothing but labor and time and the willingness to bleed. A typical winter morning inside the ring. Mara rose before dawn and walked the inner path with a lantern, checking stems for storm damage, noting where new growth needed trimming, where a gap had opened in the east arc, where the drift on the north face was building close to the passage entrance. The cattle, 6 head now, up from the 2 gaunt cows that had been her entire herd in 1884, stood in the yard with frost on their backs but no wind in their faces. The stove drew clean and steady, the chimney pulling without interruption, because the air that reached the cabin walls was too diminished to disrupt the draft. Willa fed the chickens. Gideon split firewood from the pruning pile, each piece of Osage Orange so dense that the axe bounced twice before it found the grain. He stacked the splits against the south wall of the addition in rows so even they looked like masonry. The ring was not beautiful from the outside. It was dark, tangled, thorny, and unwelcoming, a fortress of spines that looked more like a barrier against people than a shelter for them. But from the inside, standing in the yard on a January morning with the wind moaning against the outer branches and the snow falling straight down into the calm air, it was the quietest place in Custer County, a place where heat stayed in the stove and breath stayed in the body, and a child could walk from the cabin to the well without bracing against anything. The courtship happened the way everything happened on the Lorimer claim, through work. Gideon came to help measure Alma Prager's hedge lines and stayed to measure Mara's pruning cuts. He came to survey a boundary dispute between 2 homesteaders and stayed to eat supper at Mara's table and argue about whether the East Arc needed a 4th row. He came to deliver a school report to Willa and stayed to help Mara drive stakes for a new section of the South Hedge, working in silence for 2 hours. The only sound the thud of the mallet and the scrape of the chain in the grass. He did not court with gifts or compliments, or any of the rituals that women in novels seem to require. He courted by showing up by being useful, by treating Mara's knowledge as something worth studying rather than something to be managed. He asked her opinion about wind angles and listened to the answer. He brought her a protractor and showed her that the offset she had planted by instinct was within 2 degrees of the optimal angle he had calculated on paper. And when she said, "I did not need the protractor," he said, "No. But now you know why your instinct was right, and that means you can teach the reason, not just the feeling." It was, Mara realized much later, the same thing Leander had done, recognized competence and responded to it with respect. Gideon was not Leander. He was younger, more verbal, more insistent on documentation, and far more likely to clean his spectacles during a moment that did not require spectacle cleaning. But the quality was the same. He saw what she had built and did not try to improve it. He tried to understand it. Gideon and Mara married in the autumn of 1891 in a ceremony conducted by the circuit preacher in the yard between the cabin and the south hedge. Cora stood as witness. Halvorstein brought salt and bread, which was the Norwegian custom for a new household. Willa wore a dress Mara had sewn from fabric traded for apple butter, and she held the pruning knife during the ceremony because someone had to hold it, and she was the one who knew what it meant. The marriage changed the household, but not its structure. Gideon moved his books into the cabin and his surveyor's tools into the addition, and left Mara's knife hanging on the wall beside the stove, exactly where it had hung since the day she wrapped it in oilcloth after Leander's burial. He did not rearrange. He did not improve. He added himself to something that was already built, the way a new branch adds itself to a trunk without changing the direction of the tree. They continued to argue about documentation. Gideon believed the Hedge method needed to exist on paper, diagrams, measurements, species notes, spacing charts, wind angle calculations, so that people who never met Mara could plant correctly. Mara believed the method lived in hands and eyes, and the particular intelligence that comes from kneeling in the dirt and feeling which way the wind pushes the grass. "What happens when you are gone?" Gideon asked one evening, sitting at the table with his ledger open and his pencil worn to a stub. "Willa teaches." "What happens when Willa is gone?" "Then whoever Willa taught teaches after her." "And if they teach it wrong? If they close the gaps the way Collier did? If they plant at 15 feet instead of 40 and bury their own barn in drift?" Mara looked at the wall where the knife hung. She thought about Leander, who had taught her by feel and by demonstration, and who had died before the method was anything more than a circle of thorns on one woman's claim. She thought about the gaps, not in Hedges, but in understanding, the places where knowledge fails because the teacher is gone and the student has only memory to guide them. "Write it down," she said, "but make them plant one row by hand before they read a single word." Gideon wrote the pamphlet that winter, 8 pages hand-lettered in his careful school teacher's script, with diagrams he drew using a ruler and India ink on paper he bought in Broken Bow. He titled it Notes on Porous Windbreaks for the High Plains, and listed the author as M. Lorimer. Mara objected to the formality. Gideon said that a method without a name attached becomes folklore, and folklore drifts until it loses its shape. He printed 20 copies on the school's letterpress. Mara distributed them to neighbors who asked. Halvorstein's wife translated the key diagrams into Norwegian labels for the Scandinavian families north of the Loop. Alma Prager sent a copy to her sister in Saline County, Kansas. The pamphlet traveled the way the Hedge apples had traveled, hand to hand, claim to claim, carried by people who had seen the method work and wanted others to see it too. By the middle of the 1890s, 6 claims near the Lorimer place had hedge belts or partial windbreaks planted on Mara and Leander's principles. Not all were full rings. Most were north and west L-shaped plantings, two walls of protection against the prevailing winter gale set 30 to 50 feet from the cabin or barn. Halvorstein had the most elaborate design, a three-row arc along his north boundary with a secondary brush and hedge V around his lambing pen. The V angled into the prevailing wind with gaps between each section. Cora Bessett's hedge, now 6 years established, stood 8 feet and had been plashed and woven tight, and during the storms of 93 and 94, it caught drifts as tall as Emmett's shoulders, while the yard behind it stayed clear enough for the chickens to scratch. New settlers arriving in the county were told two things by those who had survived: where to dig a well and where the winter wind runs. The second piece of advice carried Mara's fingerprints, whether or not her name was attached to it. Some people said the Lorimer method, some said the thorn ring, some said nothing at all. They just showed the new family where to plant and how far from the house and why the gaps mattered, the way a parent shows a child how to build a fire without explaining the chemistry of combustion. The knowledge moved outward. It moved slowly, the way hedges grow, a few feet each year, each new season adding density to what was already there. It did not transform the plains. It did not end the killing winters or make the wind gentle or turn Custer County into a sheltered valley. But in the places where it took root, the losses were smaller, the cabins held longer, and the children who walked to school in January had something between them and the gale, besides luck and the hope that someone would find them before the cold did. A man named Plesser, who had homesteaded north of the Loop Breaks in 1889, planted a 3-row north hedge in his first spring after seeing Halvor Steen's design. His wife kept a diary. In the entry for January of 1893, she wrote that the wind had blown for 2 days without stopping, and that their neighbor to the east had lost his entire woodpile to drift, the snow burying the stacked cords so deep that they could not dig them out before the stove went cold. The Plesser cabin, she wrote, had a clear path to the woodpile because the hedge had caught the drift 30 feet away. She did not mention Mara's name. She did not need to. The method had traveled far enough to become a local fact rather than one woman's invention. Barbed wire was spreading. The railroads promoted it. The fencing companies sold it cheap. By the late 90s, many homesteaders had stopped maintaining hedgerows and replaced them with wire that cost less labor, held cattle well enough, and did not require 3 years of trimming and plashing. The Osage Orange hedges that had lined boundaries and roads across Nebraska began to thin as farmers chose convenience over density. But during the hard winters, the ones that came every 5 or 7 years with a violence that seemed personal, as if the prairie remembered what it was and wanted to remind the people who lived on it, the old thorn rows still mattered. The cattle behind hedges survived. The cabins inside windbreaks held, and the families who had planted Mara's Way buried fewer animals and fewer neighbors than the families who had not, with the consistency of something that was not luck or chance or a freak of terrain. It was knowledge. It worked when you used it. It failed when you did not. Like any real thing, Mara Lorimer lived on the claim into the early years of the 20th century. The cabin grew around her. Additions, repairs, a new roof of sawn lumber that replaced the sod Thomas had laid in 1883. The hedge grew above her, the north arc now so tall that it cast a shadow across the yard in the early morning, a dark line that moved with the sun and vanished by noon. Willa married a railroad surveyor's son from Kearney named Arthur Payne, had 3 children, and taught her oldest to trim Osage Orange leaders before he could saddle a horse. The boy took to it the way Willa had taken to it, not as a chore, but as a conversation with something alive. each cut a question and each season's growth the answer. Gideon taught school until his eyes went dim from decades of close work, then spent his last years measuring things by touch: the thickness of a trunk, the distance between stems, the texture of bark that told him whether a branch was alive or dead. He died in 1915 in the addition he had built, surrounded by books and surveyor's tools and the faint green smell of hedge wood drying beside the stove. Mara's hands never softened. The calluses she had built in the summer of 1884, pressing seedlings into dirt that most of Custer County thought would reject them, remained until the end, thick, cracked, and cross-hatched with white thorn scars that she wore the way a stonemason wears the dust in the lines of his palms. She did not consider them marks of hardship. She considered them proof of contact with something that had held. In her last years, she walked the inner path every morning after a snowfall, slow now, with a hand on the woven trunks for balance. The hedge was taller than the cabin. The North Arc trunks were thick as fence posts, dark as ironwood, the thorns worn smooth along the lower branches where cattle had rubbed against them for 3 decades. She touched the plashed joints where Leander had taught her to cut and bend, and the wood was warm under her hand even in January, because living wood holds a heat that dead timber does not combustion heat, but the heat of something still growing, still pushing sap through its veins, still reaching for the light. She died in the spring of 1921. She died in the cabin she had kept, in the bed beside the stove, with the pruning knife still hanging on the wall in its oilcloth wrap. Willa sharpened the blade that spring, the way Mara had sharpened it every spring for 33 years. The steel was thin as a thumbnail from decades of grinding. It still cut clean. By the time Mara's daughter was grown and teaching, the Lorimer hedge was no longer called a weed fence. 6 families had planted some version of it: full rings for the most exposed cabins, north and west belts for barns, and shorter thorn rows along the paths children walked to school. The method did not spread through pamphlets or county programs. It spread through work, one neighbor showing another where the drift formed, where the calm pocket sat, one child remembering which side of the hedge went quiet first when the wind came. Mara lived out her later years on the same 160 acres she had nearly lost to debt and winter, and the patient confidence of a man who thought a widow's failure was an investment opportunity. The original North Arc grew higher than the cabin roof, and so thick that a grown man could not push through with his full weight, leaned against the stems. She kept Leander Voss's pruning knife wrapped in oilcloth on the wall, not as a memorial, but as a tool, still sharpened every spring, still used every autumn when the leaders needed cutting, and the plashing needed tightening, and the hedge needed the attention of someone who understood that a living barrier does not maintain itself. Return to January 12th, 1888. The white wall descending from a sky that had been blue an hour before. The wind that erased the world and turned half a mile of open prairie into a distance no person could survive crossing without something to hold. A child's hand gripping the hem of a dead man's coat. The hedge vanishing under the very snow, forced from the air, buried, bent, holding, the thorns catching ice and the stems flexing under 10,000 pounds of drift, and not one of them breaking, because they had been woven to hold each other the way a family holds itself together when the weight comes down. And Rafe Dorr's voice, carrying across 6 years of certainty: "A weed fence won't warm a stove." Inside the circle of thorns, the stove door glowed red. The cattle breathed steam against the still air. Willa slept with her face pressed to her mother's arm, and her breathing was steady, and the cough that had rattled in her chest for 3 winters was quiet. The wind that had killed across the open plains, that had frozen Emery Vale's ear and Jory Pell's hands, and buried 41 head of cattle against a wire fence, and taken a 2-year-old child from a family named Dalgard, that wind spent itself tearing at branches 50 feet from the walls, because a cooper's daughter had remembered that a broken face makes the blow spend itself, and had planted 750 thorns in a circle on the open prairie to prove it. The storm did not spare Mara Lorimer's cabin. She gave the storm somewhere else to spend its strength.